She didn't choose the name. A trader once told her that's what her food did, made rough hearts tender, so the name stuck like stew to a wooden spoon. Mama Kassa had the kind of presence that turned noise into listening. She was wide at the hips, easy in the smile, and quick to forgive. Her hair, always braided back, caught flower dust in the lines like moonlight. On her right wrist, she wore a threadbare red ribbon her son tied before leaving for mechanic training in a coastal city. She didn't take it off, said it helped her remember which hand to trust when measuring salt. People said her pots could hear. That was foolish, of course, but you might have believed it if you stood there at dawn and watched her work. She stirred and the spoon made a hollow music. She tasted and the flame calmed down. She salted and the broth seemed to sit up straighter, wanting to be its best self. If a laborer came by with shoulders drooping like wet laundry, she would touch the rim of the bowl before handing it over, as if inviting the food to do more than fill a stomach. "Eat," she would say, "so your bones remember they were made for standing." Some cooks measure their worth in coins. Mama Kassa kept a different ledger. She noted who returned empty bowls clean, who stacked benches after the lunch rush, who murmured thanks with a sincerity that made her eyes water, though she always pretended it was the onions. If you had money, you paid. If you did not, she cut the meat a little smaller, slid it beneath the sauce like a shy fish under reeds, and said, "Bring me a story next time." People think that's nothing, but stories are a kind of currency in a place that forgets too quickly. Her closest neighbor at the market was Madame Agbeke of Royal Deluxe Foods, a woman with lacquered nails and a stall as shiny as a politician's smile. Agbeke hired girls to clap and sing when she flipped a lid. As if sound could season food, her prices were high, her portions careful, and her eyes never left the math in her head. To her, generosity looked like a hole in a pocket, and to her kind, holes must be stitched shut. The first trouble came small enough to laugh at. One morning the firewood at Mama Kassa's stall hissed the way wood hisses when it remembers yesterday's rain, though the sky had been dry for a week. She coaxed it like you coax a stubborn child. "Come on," she said. "We have mouths to meet." The second trouble came with a soft stink. The palm oil she'd bought from the reputable Tinubu boy turned cloudy, then grainy, as if it didn't want to become part of anything. The third trouble arrived mean. Her jar of stock cubes had turned to chalk. When she crumbled one, the dust, bitter and wrong, blew into her eyes and made them sting. She shrugged and worked around each bother. Firewood that wouldn't catch, she borrowed from the pepper cellar. Oil that refused kindness. She skimmed it off and fried in what remained, chalky cubes. She pounded dried shrimp she'd been saving for holidays. If you've lived long enough, you know how to cook with what life doesn't take away. But Kasamba is a town that counts. People counted how many men stood in Mama Kassa's line. They counted how many times she smiled in an hour, as if smiles were hoarded in gourd jars. They counted the times school children, faces dusty and hopeful, chose her stew over the flashier place next door. Counting can turn into resentment if you don't balance your books with gratitude. A small council of vendors began meeting behind the spice shop where the pepper sacks bled red onto the dirt. They weren't evil, they were ordinary, which can be worse. Envy wears ordinary faces. There was Alhaja Karimat, who sold fried bean cakes and blessings for an extra coin. There was Auntie Ebo, who could shell groundnuts faster than a rumor spreads. There was the cassava man who had never trusted a woman with more customers than he had. And there was Madame Agbeke, who smiled only with her teeth. "She undercuts," said one. "She gives on credit," said another. "She prays into those pots," said a third, as if prayer had an aftertaste. "She makes me look stingy," said Agbeke simply. That, more than anything, was unforgivable. They didn't say, "Let us ruin her." They said, "Let us protect ourselves." It's easier to do wrong with a clean word in your mouth. The town chairman, a man whose belly reached a second before the rest of him, signed a sanitation initiative with a flourish. Official-looking men appeared at dawn 2 days later, wearing orange vests with badges stitched slightly crooked. They checked permits that had never existed before and weighed pots as if weight could tell cleanliness. They frowned at Mama Kassa's crooked sign, tapped their pens on their clipboards, and announced a small fine that grew larger with every sentence they spoke. "You will pay," one said, "else you will close." "I will pay," she said, with time to gather the coins. They gave her until the next market day, the day Kasamba swelled like a living drum. Traders came in from river villages with nets still damp. Women balanced basins like crowns. Men wheeled squeaking barrows of yams that looked like limbs of sleeping giants. Children wove between ankles and tired jokes. The air was a soup of iron and sun. By 5 a.m., Mama Kassa's fire was licking pot bottoms. By 6, the broth had found its voice. By 7, a line snaked down Dune Road, and the neem tree held a new shade it hadn't had the day before, the color of hungry anticipation. People greeted each other by asking what they planned to order. Jollof, swallow, fish, whatever she says my day needs, said one tired nurse, and everyone laughed because they understood. Around 8, a breeze came through the market that wasn't weather. It carried cologne and calculation. The sanitation men were back. They made a point of inspecting other stalls first, prodding here, squinting there, nodding nowhere. When they reached Mama Kassa, their pens were already eager. Permit, here. Fire certificate, never had one, never needed. New law, since we say. They lifted lids without washing hands, tasted with their eyes, smelled with their superior noses, and frowned at things that had frown-proofed themselves for years. One leaned too hard on the wooden table, another shook the bucket where she kept her washed spoons and declared the water not clear enough, though you could count your regrets at the bottom. A crowd gathered the way crowds do, like ants around spilled sugar, sweet with outrage they would soon forget. The sanitation men murmured about non-compliance. The word sounded important. The word sounded like a door closing. They tagged her stall with a bright sticker that said, sealed in letters large enough to shame. Tomorrow, they said, you can reopen, bring your receipt. Tomorrow, she echoed and set her ladle down carefully, the way you set a sleeping baby. The line dispersed in a soft grumble, dissolving back into the market. People muttered sympathetic things that cost nothing and bought their lunch elsewhere. That afternoon, the sky lowered until you could reach up and touch its gray belly. The first rain can smell like forgiveness if you've been waiting long enough. The drops began fat and slow, then found rhythm, drumming on zinc, turning the market lanes into shallow veins of water. Traders threw tarps over pyramids of produce. Boys ran laughing, shorts clinging, sandals slapping. Rain in Kasamba isn't a conversation, it's a crowd that decides things. Mama Kassa stayed under the neem, watching water bead along the ribbon on her wrist. She had not cried when the sticker went up. She would not cry now. But the rain moved through her clothes and into her bones, and something in her loosened. She packed in silence, wrapped her pot in a cloth that smelled of bay leaves and old smoke, and waited for the downpour to soften into a wet whisper. Then she hefted the pot, heavier than any she'd lifted, and started for home. Dune Road runs downhill, then up again, then down into the part of town where houses look like they were set down gently and never moved. She turned on a narrow path bordered by cassava stems and ended on a dirt lane behind a church that was more echo than building. Her compound was a square of rooms with a courtyard in the middle and a tap that coughed more than it flowed. The red ribbon on her wrist was dark now, the color of a warning swallowed. She set the pot down under the overhang, wiped her hands on her wrapper, and struck a match to boil water for tea. The match died, regretting it. She struck another. The flame leaned away, then surrendered. She set the kettle, and the metal clicked its small clicks. Rain softened to drizzle. From somewhere in the compound, a radio sang a song about a woman who forgot a man, or a man who forgot a woman. Kasamba has a dozen songs for each mistake. Across town, at Royal Deluxe, Madame Agbeke poured herself a glass of mineral water and let the cold sit against her front teeth until they ached pleasantly. "We cannot let sentiment run the market," she told a friend who nodded, because nodding is cheaper than arguing. "People must learn boundaries." The friend smiled without showing gums and said something that sounded like agreement but wasn't. That night, Agbeke dreamed of a table that kept growing and hands that kept reaching. In the dream, her ladle never found the bottom of the pot. She woke with her heart running. She did not tell anyone. At dusk, the power returned to Kasamba and left again before anyone could celebrate. The rain paused, reconsidered, and came back. The wind pushed. You could smell the river iron and fish, and a promise that the banks would not hold if the argument continued. Someone shouted down the lane that the big storm had knocked a branch into the transformer. Someone else said the transformer was old anyway and needed replacing. Everyone agreed with both because helplessness likes consensus. Under the neem, the market had already folded into itself, tarps tied, poles stacked. The day reduced to footprints and the smell of things that would ripen by morning. A teenage boy named Lado, one of those boys who becomes everyone's child when he laughs, passed by Mama Kassa's compound with an umbrella the size of a satellite dish. "Mama," he called through the rain. "They said tomorrow you can open." She stepped to the doorway. "Tomorrow is stubborn," she answered. "You want me to carry anything? Carry this blessing," she said and mimed dropping something heavy into his hands. He grinned, balanced the invisible weight on his head, and ran on. Night fell the way it always does, suddenly and completely, as if someone pinched the wick of the day between wet fingers. In the dark, the rain sounded closer to the skin. In the dark, memory moves closer to the lips. Mama poured hot water over tea leaves and ginger slices, watched the steam curl like handwriting she couldn't read, and thought of her son tightening bolts somewhere by the sea. She never wrote long letters, she cooked them into soups and prayed the steam would carry the message. Eat well, be kind, remember home. There are nights when a town keeps itself company, the streets talking to themselves softly. This was not one of those. The wind had an opinion and the rain did too. Somewhere far off, a loud pop chased down the lanes and lay flat, the way sound does when it hits water. People shouted. A woman laughed that nervous laugh that means I am afraid, but let's not say so. Then another pop, and a hot glare against the clouds, electric, wrong and hungry. The transformer had lost its argument. In Kasamba, disaster rarely comes dressed as catastrophe. It comes dressed as a short decision, layered over other short decisions, buttoned up by excuses. The storm tore at a sheet of zinc that had been poorly nailed. The zinc lifted like a sail. A spark traveled along a cable that should have been replaced 2 storms ago. Wind shoved, rain encouraged, and everything that could go right went left. Later, people would retell it with better sentences, but all Mama Kassa knew was that the neem tree groaned, the zinc screamed, and the roof over her overhang jumped like a frightened animal. She grabbed for the pot as the edge of the metal came down. It caught the sign instead, ripped it clean off, and flung it into the yard where it lay face down in mud, the word tender pressed into the earth. The pot rolled, bumped the courtyard step, and settled on its side like a tired cow. In the scuffle, the lantern fell and licked a puddle of spilled kerosene. Flame does what it was born to do. It ran. She moved fast, faster than her knees allowed most days. She threw a cloth over the flame and it melted like sugar. She reached for the bucket by the tap and the tap coughed up its usual nothing. She shouted for a neighbor and heard her own voice come back from the lane, thinner. Smoke rose in a new language, cruel in its grammar. She pulled the pot away from the spreading light. But the handle had heated like anger. She let go with a hiss and the ribbon on her wrist burned through, the knot finally giving up its long duty. A door across the lane opened and closed again. Someone called, "Are you all right?" the way people call through glass. A boy, Lado maybe, ran 2 steps toward the gate and stopped, his umbrella useless against a fire that didn't care about rain. He looked left and right for other help. He looked up. The way people do even when there is no one on rooftops. He froze between before and after. Inside the courtyard, smoke braided itself into the rain and said enough. The little overhang swallowed flame until it choked. A tilt of zinc fell with a sound like a full stop. The lantern, heroic and foolish, gave one last sputter and died. Silence returned with a limp. In that sudden hush, you could hear the pot, round and scratched, settle its weight. If you were the kind of person who believed pots could hear, you might have thought it sighed. When the neighbors finally came, they found the overhang blackened and the ground slick. They found the sign face down, the ribbon melted into a little red question on the concrete. They did not find Mama Kassa. Her room was empty, her mat rolled, her kettle still warm. On the table sat a small bowl of tea leaves, and beside it a scrap of paper torn from the back of a sales ledger. It held a short sentence in a careful hand, the kind of hand that learned letters late and treated each like a guest. If food can remember, let it remember mercy. People will give any mystery an ending if you let them. Some said she ran to the river because river water steals heat from grief. Some said the fire took her quickly and the rain hid the ash because even the sky was on her side. Some swore they saw her walk into the storm with the pot on her head and the steam curling like a scarf around her face. The church elders prayed a safe return. The chairman frowned publicly and signed another paper privately. Madame Agbeke sold out by mid-morning, which looked like success if you didn't count the way her hands shook when she made change. For a week, Kasamba behaved like a place with poor eyesight. People squinted at shadows. They mistook one another for someone else and apologized quickly. At night, the wind did an impression of a wooden spoon against a pot and made nerves stand like hair. A rumor began, not a loud rumor, those are easy to ignore, but a small one that crawled along bench slats and under market tables. It said, on rain nights, down by the old ferry ramp, a new food stall opens. No sign, no song, just a pot and a woman who asks what your day needs. You know how towns are. We cannot resist a story that might feed us. The first to go were the boys who deliver packages on tiny motorcycles. The kind who know every shortcut and every gossip. Who is she? They asked each other. Where did the stall come from? How does the fire burn without smoke? They came back quieter than they left, saying the stew tasted like something they had tried once in a different house on a day when somebody loved them more than they deserved. When they described the cook's face, each got it wrong. Some said she was young, some old. Some swore they saw a scar shaped like a comma tucked near one eye, blinking. She is nobody, said one boy with awe, as if nobody was the most important person he had ever met. I was late to hear it. I fix radios for a living, the kind that swallow stations and forget to spit them back. The night I followed the rumor, the rain began like a polite knock and then let itself in. My coat failed its promise, and my shoes wrote complaint letters with every step. Down by the ferry ramp, the river was a wide shoulder shrugging off the day. A single lantern stood on a post, brave and pale, and beneath it a pot sat on 3 stones, humming the low song pots hum when they're earning their keep. She stood behind it, head wrapped, face calm. If this were a different story, I would say the lantern light kept losing her and finding her again. But I remember thinking only that she looked like home the second before you opened the door. She greeted me without the push of sails in her voice. What does your day need? She asked. Kindness, I said, surprising myself. She nodded as if she had suspected that already. Her ladle moved like a priest's hand over water. She filled a bowl and held it a moment longer than necessary, as if listening for something only she and the pot could hear. The steam hit my face and smelt of pepper and rain and a memory I couldn't place, the way you can't place a song you know you should know. I took a spoonful and paused. The taste was not new, but it did something new. It turned me around inside so I was facing a door I'd closed years ago. In the bowl's reflection, I saw an older version of myself, one who had stepped out from a line on Dune Road and said, "Leave the sticker, we'll eat anyway," but that man never existed. The stew suggested he could have. Lightning stitched light across the water. The lantern flickered and recovered. When I looked up from the bowl, the cook was watching me, not with hunger for my praise, but the way a tailor looks at a jacket and decides where to ease a seam. "You will come back," she said. "Will I?" I asked and wiped rain from my face. "Some things return whether we invite them or not," she answered, and lifted her ladle to serve the next man. Behind me, the river coughed up a log. The rain thickened, the kind of thick that makes you want to go confess to somebody about something. I turned to leave, bowl clean enough not to embarrass me. When I glanced back, the cook had leaned into the steam, whispering. Maybe it was a prayer, maybe it was instructions. Maybe she was reminding the stew of a name it had once known and forgotten, mine, yours, a town's. Kasamba slept uneasily that night, and in the morning people described their dreams with a new seriousness. A woman dreamed of hands placing a bowl in front of her and taking away her bitterness like it was a stone from her throat. A man dreamed of his market stall roof bending low to shield someone else from rain. Madame Agbeke woke tasting pepper she hadn't eaten, and for a moment her eyes softened into the person she almost became once. No one said ghost, not yet. Words like that wait until you ask them twice. But by the third rain night, even the skeptical agreed on one small point. The stew made you remember more than you wanted and exactly what you needed. Some men laughed that off. Others did not show their faces at the ferry ramp again. And somewhere in the slip space between season and weather, a pot began to learn names. It rained 3 nights out of 5 that month, and the town learned the new weather like a schedule. On the ferry ramp, where the river shrugged the day off its shoulders, the lantern glowed like a patient eye, and the pot sang its low-working song. Those who had eaten once began to arrive without speaking. A hush lived around the stall, as if sound itself removed its sandals before coming closer. No prices were posted. No bargaining happened. People learned the rules without being taught. Don't shout, don't point, don't make the food hurry. When she asked, "What does your day need?" you answered honestly or not at all. A lie in that place felt like trying to stand on wet glass. From the first bowl she served each night, a thin ribbon of steam curled and wrote shapes in the air that looked, if you were tired or guilty, like letters beginning to form your name. I went back the second week, this time with Lado, the umbrella boy whose laugh belonged to everyone. Rain patted the river into small shivers. He stood beside me, half hiding behind the umbrella, half proud to be trusted with adult secrecy. "She ties a red ribbon on the ladle handle sometimes," he whispered. "Only when it rains very hard. You saw that?" Lado nodded, eyes wide. "Same knot as Mama Kassa wore, the stubborn knot." The cook lifted her head as if someone had spoken her name. Her face was calm the way a river is calm when it's decided not to flood, calm with strength under it. Her eyes found mine, held a second too long to be casual. Then moved on. I swear the pot burbled as if clearing its throat. "What does your day need?" she asked Lado. He blurted, courage, then colored at his own daring. She dipped the ladle, waited, dipped again, and handed him a bowl that smelled like dry clothes after rain. He took one spoonful, went apple still, and then stood up straighter, like someone had reminded his bones of their job. He whispered, "Thank you," to the steam. The steam accepted. The first man who changed because of that food did not die. His name was Osa, one of the sanitation officers whose badge had looked important and whose pen had loved the word sealed. He came the way men come to places they don't believe in, hands in pockets, chin forward, saying, "Let me see this nonsense so I can laugh in the right key tomorrow." He stood in line behind a nurse, in front of a mason with mortar on his sleeves. The rain darkened his shirt to the color of regret before it reached his skin. "What does your day need?" the cook asked. "Warmth," he said, surprising himself, and then wondered why he had said that. She served him a portion that seemed too small until he lifted the spoon. When the stew touched his tongue, his face rearranged itself, maybe the only honest expression it had worn in months. He tasted paper, the thin, raspy paper of forms he had never read but signed because his superior told him to. He tasted envelopes handled too often. He tasted a morning on Dune Road when a woman stood very still while his pen scratched fat letters across her life. He tasted the word tomorrow and how heavy it can be in another person's mouth. He ate 2 more spoonfuls and then stopped, set the bowl down as if it contained a small sleeping animal, and stepped away from the light. I watched him walk into the rain and stand with his face turned upward like a plant. When he left, he looked 10 years older and for the first time worth those years. 2 days later, someone found a brown envelope propped against the neem tree stump in Mama Kassa's old spot. Inside lay wads of crumpled receipts and cash and a short note. "I sealed what fed us. Forgive me. No name, but people in Kasamba can hear handwriting." Osa returned to the ramp the following week and didn't eat. He just stood to one side, letting rain have him. And when his turn came to speak, he raised his voice without raising it. "I did wrong," he told whoever was listening. "I'll fix what I can and I'll carry what I cannot." The cook's mouth tilted, not a smile exactly, but some lighter weather passed over it. The pot simmered in agreement. "Mercy, I thought, isn't soft. It's a blade that refuses to cut what it could." Madame Agbeke heard the rumors and sent her girls to fetch a bowl to compare product, she said. As if righteousness were an inventory column. The girls left laughing and returned quiet, set the covered bowl on the counter, and quit before noon the next day. Agbeke called them ungrateful and told the new hires never to mention the river. But she went herself on a Thursday, dressed in rainproof pride. The lantern showed her face the way lanterns do, honestly, with no opinion. For a second, her reflection in the soup looked 14. Missing the front tooth she lost falling off a bicycle, the day a woman from the old quarter, whose name she had long deleted, gave her a free bowl and said, "Don't cry into your food, little one. Salt it when you must." She almost turned away, but hunger is an efficient liar. She told herself she had come to inspect a rival. "What does your day need?" the cook asked. "Efficiency," Agbeke said, and then hated the word coming out dressed like a person. The stew tasted like a street where she'd once held hands with a dream and then traded it for a ledger. It tasted like the afternoon she pretended not to see a sealed sticker because seeing it would have cost her profit. It tasted like a girl without a front tooth chewing hope. She finished the bowl like a woman paying a debt, walked home in a rain that had stopped falling, and lay awake until the morning decided to arrive. The next day she portioned her food a little larger and didn't raise her prices to match. No one noticed immediately. Goodness rarely trends. The rumor swelled and thinned like rumors do. Some claimed the cook was a saint. Others said juju with their mouths and justice with their eyes. Boys with more bravado than sense dared each other to ask for forgiveness, and then laughed to cover how their knees argued with them. A bus conductor swore the stew brought his hearing back in one ear. A teacher wrote her resignation on a napkin and then fed it to a trash can instead of a future she had the courage to meet. And then Seyi came home. He was taller than memory had promised and thinner, the way cities siphon flesh from young men and pay back in vocabulary. Hands smelled faintly of grease, a perfume that says I fix things I did not break. Someone had sent a letter from the church, your mother is not dead or she is too alive, which in Kasamba is the same kind of trouble. Come home. He arrived with a brown backpack and the same not skill in his fingers that had once tied a ribbon on his mother's wrist to remind her which hand measured salt by memory. People told him a dozen endings for the same story. He listened, face still. He picked up the torn sign in the courtyard, the one that once read food for tender hearts, and wiped the caked mud until the word tender peeked through like a shy child. He sat with that word for a long time as if it were a person he had wronged. Then he folded the sign under his arm and walked to the river in a rain that had not decided to begin, but did anyway when he asked. He stood at the edge of the lantern's circle. The cook did not look up. The pot burbled a name, his, and he almost said mother the way a person almost steps back from a cliff and then remembers their feet are braver than their fear. What does your day need? She asked. He wanted to say answers. He wanted to say you, he said home. Her eyes shifted, not quite softening, not quite hardening, just becoming more like themselves. This will not feed you, she said, and did not serve him. Instead, she reached beneath the table, lifted the old sign he had cleaned, now scrubbed smooth and sanded, and passed it across the invisible border between them. A chopping board, burnished and oiled. The word tender still ghosting the grain if you tilted it toward kindness. Take this, she said, build a place that remembers why it was built. He took it. His hands shook the way hands do when a thing that should not be possible insists on being true. He wanted to ask, are you at peace? He wanted to ask, who must I forgive to free you? The river answered for her, laying a wet finger to his lips. He backed into the dark and tried to remember how walking works. Back at the compound, he hung the board on a nail and sat beneath it, listening to rain read the roof. In the morning he visited the town chairman, the market elders, Osa with the brown envelope, the pepper seller who knew everything and pretended to know nothing. He asked questions that sounded simple and did not let silence have the last word. At dusk he returned to the river and did not eat again. Kasamba, being Kasamba, appointed a committee. It was called the Committee on Unregulated Nighttime Vendors, which is how towns hide fear under syllables. The chairman led it, Madam Agbeke funded it, 2 elders blessed it, 1 policeman promised it legal shape. They planned an inspection. They borrowed a camera from the council secretary who was good at birthdays and bad at secrecy. They chose a dry night, assembled at the ferry ramp, and waited with the kind of impatience that pretends to be duty. Nothing came, no lantern. No pot, only the river arguing with its stones. We'll return tomorrow, the chairman declared, eager to dismiss the disappointment. There must be permits to check. They returned the next night to find the ground damp and the air smelling of pepper soot, though the sky had been clear since noon. A small ring of people stood as if they had been made to grow there. The lantern burned without a wick. The pot steamed without smoke. The cook looked up and counted the committee without using numbers. What does your day need? She asked the chairman. He adjusted his importance, which had wrinkled in the humidity. Compliance. She served him a measure so exact it insulted him. He lifted the spoon in a hand trained to sign things more than to hold them. The stew tasted like a red ribbon burning through on a storm night, like a signature that turned a bowl into a sentence, like the moment he decided to be a man who enjoyed saying since we say. He felt his mouth fill with a heat that was not chilly, but a memory of himself before the belly came. He swallowed, and for a second his face looked like mercy practicing. He set the bowl down and looked at Osa across the circle. Osa did not blink. The chairman took a breath, found it heavier than it used to be, and said, "We will require fewer stickers." He said it to the soup, but the river heard him. A murmur lapped around the gathered bodies. One of the elders, gray to his bones and tired of being right in public and wrong in private, stepped forward and placed coins beside the pot, not as payment, but as proof that a hand could offer instead of take. The cook nodded, not in thanks, but in recognition, like this is the beginning of a beginning. The policeman tried to switch on the camera. It refused to remember how. He gave up and pretended he had never intended to film souls anyway. That night when I got home, my workbench smelled faintly of pepper. On my radio's dusty faceplate, someone had written with a damp finger, "If food can remember, let it remember mercy." I wiped it away and the words remained, not on the plastic but in the room, like a song after the band has gone. I lay down and thought about the morning years ago when I watched the orange vests at Dune Road and told myself it was not my business. About the way I had eaten that day at a different stall and complimented the onions as if clever seasoning could launder a cowardice. In the dream that took me, I sat on a bench at the river. The cook ladled steam onto my hands like water before prayer. "What does your day need?" she asked. "Forgiveness," I said. "For whom?" "For the man who watched a sticker become a wall." She nodded, approval or sorrow, I couldn't tell, and poured the steam back into the pot, which accepted it like a story returning to the mouth that first told it. I woke up to rain gnawing at the zinc and a headache that tasted like honesty. In those weeks, the river stall worked like weather across Kasamba. It did not kill, it did something fiercer. It returned people to the moment just before they became the wrong version of themselves, and let them stand there again, longer, with clearer sight. A market woman who had laughed the day the sealed sticker went up dreamt for 7 nights of a girl with flour dust in her hair, and on the 8th day she walked to Seyi's compound with a basin and a scrub brush. She cleaned soot from the overhang without being asked, and left a jar of palm oil under the table with the label peeled off. When Seyi thanked her, she said, "Don't thank me. Thank your mother for feeding me the day my child was sick." She did not say she had once told a friend that prayer and stew tasted like manipulation. Some confessions are best made to roofs. One of Agbeke's oldest customers stopped at the ferry ramp and asked for peace. The stew tasted like an afternoon when he had walked past a woman sweeping bitter leaves around her stall and not greeted her because greeting kindness felt like agreeing with it. He went home and called his sister after a silence of 3 years. No one wrote that down, but the town felt taller by a finger width. Not everyone changed. A few men drank their bowls like punishment and spat the aftertaste into the river, then boasted about it at the bar with laughter too loud for the joke. People who must not learn will not learn, stew or no stew. But the number of people who could learn began to grow like groundnuts in good rain. Seyi opened his gate each morning and found small proofs left by night. A sack of dried fish from someone who couldn't meet his eyes. A coil of rope for the roof from someone who didn't have rope to spare. A tiny wooden spoon carved with a clumsy hand and a careful heart. He hung the spoon on a nail beside the board that still said tender if you asked it to. Sometimes he stood on Dune Road at noon, eyes closed, listening for his mother's laugh inside the market's noise. Sometimes he went to the river at night and did not cross the circle of light, hands in pockets so they would not reach for a ghost. He spoke to the pot in his mind, and it answered with the sound soup makes when it forgives you for burning it. One evening, as rain stitched the river to its banks, the cook lifted her head and her eyes scanned the line. She paused, as if listening for something behind people's faces. When my turn came, she held the ladle still, and the steam wrote a shape that felt too much like the first letter of my name. "What does your day need?" she asked. "Bravery," I said. Then, because the stew teaches truth, I added, "and a place to put it." "Bring it to the place where you didn't use it before," she said gently, and served me a bowl that tasted like a beginning caught in the act. I knew where she meant. I saw the orange vests in my head and the sticker in my quiet mouth. I saw Seyi standing alone under a board that used to be a sign. I finished the bowl, left my coins, and walked into the rain that felt suddenly like a request. The Committee on Unregulated Nighttime Vendors did not disband. Committees are stubborn furniture, but fewer people wanted seats on it. The chairman began to visit the old quarter without photographers. Osa stopped wearing his badge to the ramp. Madame Agbeke portioned a little too generously and pretended not to notice. And Kasamba, which had invented 100 stories to avoid the one it owed itself, began awkwardly, unevenly, to practice a new sentence that tasted less like fear and more like bread. "We did this. We can do different." On the 15th rain night, the lantern burned a little brighter and the river smoothed its back like a cat that trusts the hand above it. The pot sang names again, the way a drum sings a village, some for joy, some for warning, some to call people home. Somewhere in that song I heard my own, and I did not flinch.